And I'm just going to start with 3 or 4 quotations just to give you some sort of scene setting in chronological order. This is from the British consul in Helsinki in April, or in late 1867. One night, frost blackened the whole crops and plunged the whole country into misery, famine, and despair. To add to this distress, that dreadful malady, the famine typhus, soon made its appearance, and for the last 6 months has been making fearful ravages among the starving thousands. No district from the north of Finland to the south has escaped it, and at this moment, even in Helsingfors, it's carrying off hundreds of both rich and poor. Helsingfors is the Swedish name for Helsinki. I'll just go over these quotes without comment for the moment. The second one is from a German newspaper in March 1868. At this misery, all human emotions are lost. Without a tear, without a sigh, one sees another sinking dead at his feet and thinks that soon it will soon be their lot. If I go into a hut where a father or mother or both are sick and offer them medicine, the first word there is always, get a drop of milk and a bite of bread for the starving children, but leave us alone to lay and die, because even if we rise again from this illness, we'll just have to die of hunger. The local minister, Lutheran minister from the parish of Ruovesi at the end of March 1868, was reflecting on the fact that from the beginning of the year, he'd buried 200 of his parishioners. And of these, 18 have died of smallpox, 60 of typhus, and about the same number of poor nutrition and hunger, in other words, famine. This death begins with swollen feet, from where the tumor spreads to the entire body. And eventually a light, translucent line is seen under the eyes, and that's a sign that death is near. How many people are actually sick is difficult to contemplate, and the sure thing is it can be reckoned in hundreds. Yes, really. Those who've not seen with their own eyes will have a hard time grasping and believing the extent of the distress. So again, I include this because it's very similar to some of the descriptions you get, for example, from Skibbereen in the 1840s, these descriptions of how people perished during the famine times. And then the final short quotation, just for now, is from an English newspaper, Leeds, trying to raise money for the Finns in April 1868. Such is the state of famine in Finland that those who were employed to carry relief to the sufferers have found several villages without a living inhabitant, the corpses of the poor starved creatures lying unburied in the streets and houses. So this is a terrible famine which occurred in Europe around about 20 years, between 10 and 20 years after the Great Irish Famine. It's very comparatively little known. And when I first came to Finland in 1998, if you remember back then, it was the 150th anniversary of Black 47 had been the year before, and especially in Mayo, where I'm from, there was the big memorial in Morris had just been erected. The Rowan Gillespie Famine Memorial in Dublin by the quayside had been just put up there, and discussions of famine were everywhere. So it really stood out to me that there was not really much discussion of this famine which occurred in Finland, and it kind of inspired me to try and look why. So I'll talk a bit about that in the next half hour or so. And this is just I just like this quotation, a Skelge from a review of a book about the Finnish famine a few years ago, but just the idea that the Finnish famine is somewhat like the Irish famine, but with a blanket of snow covering it. Of course, it did snow also in Ireland and during the period of the famine, but it's somewhat evocative. And often these images, like the one on the right from a French novel set during the famine times in Finland, shows kind of people dead or dying in the snow. And I think especially for people not from Finland, in other parts of Europe where it doesn't snow as much, this is kind of part of the exoticism of that. So just to give you some context, this is this is a map I like showing. It shows how big Finland is, really. In the 1800s, Finland was an overwhelmingly rural society. At the beginning of the century, around about 90% of the people were living on the land. That got gradually less, but not very quickly less throughout the 19th century. Internal communications were very poor. And this would have its effect when it came to trying to help or get aid to the famine sufferers, but also importing grain in times of harvest failure. Because, for example, the Baltic Sea is prone to freezing, so you couldn't get ships in there during a harsh winter at the time. So you couldn't import grain, or it made it very difficult to import grain. And during the period we're interested in, there were repeated harvest failures of the main crops, which are rye, wheat, barley and oats. Rye is the main crop in Finland. So unlike our famine, where we have the potato failure, in Finland, it's mainly a failure of these cereals. And the culprit, or the trigger, is usually given as frost. So unlike, it's not a blight. It's the fact that frost comes before the harvest can be collected. So in the worst year of this famine in Finland, 1867 to 68, the frost came already on the 3rd of September, wiped out almost the entire year's harvest. And that really set up this cataclysmic final year of the Great Famine in Finland. But for me and other people interested in studying this from a famine studies perspective, you would ask the question, like, why was Finland so vulnerable, that something that actually happened quite regularly could lead to such a disaster? And it's interesting for us, I think, from an Irish point of view, that one of the reasons for that lies in the fact that Finland was what we would call a home rule society. Finland was governing its own affairs. So I'll speak a bit more about that as well, because that's the one thing I think that really fascinates me from an Irish point of view, but also it kind of explains a little bit about why it's not remembered in the same way that we remember the famine or An Gortamór. Most of the statistics, so the population of Finland was about 1.8 million at the time. In 1868, around about 9% of the population died. And then if you stretch out the famine period, that grows, especially between 66 and 68. Very significant mortality in Finland. I'll show more about that in a second, but just to give you a geographical reminder where we are, where I'm sitting at the moment. I'm basically here at the moment in Helsinki. I work here in Jyväskylä, which is in the middle of the country. So you can see there in a European context, Finland is kind of northeastern Europe. But also it's important to notice after 1809, Finland became a part of the Russian Empire. So it's also got this imperial context. And you can see, again, from an Irish point of view, there are some ways in which Finland is a periphery. It's on the edge of Europe. It's kind of on the edge of the empire. But on the other hand, if you take an imperial context, like for example, in the British Empire, if you'd include India and so on, the capitals are actually quite close. So Helsinki is here, and St. Petersburg is very close, really. And the vast sort of expanse of east in the Russian Empire is, it shows how big it is, but actually Finland is actually relatively close to the capital, in the same way, I suppose, that Dublin was close to London. And this was just returning again, sometimes I get asked, especially by actually Ukrainian colleagues who talk about their great famine in the 1930s and the millions who died, same with Ireland. And there's this kind of competitive element in some ways where they say, well, only 138,000 people died. But actually, in terms of percentage of population, it's a very significant catastrophe in global famine history. This is from Cormac O'Grada's general history of famine from a few years ago. And you can see this is the column of percentage death rate. And here's the Irish famine, which is really, in terms of 19th century history, unprecedented percentage death rate. But actually Finland is the next behind that. So Finland had, Cormac's put 7 there, you could say 7 or 8 or 9, depending on the years that you take. But anyway, very significant. And if you think about since then, only the Cambodian famine of the 1970s has had as high of a percentage death rate when it comes to comes to people dying. So So this is sometimes the justification I give for studying the Finnish famine as a kind of global event, not just because I happen to be living here, because I happen to be interested from an Irish point of view, but I think it's worth being better known also from that. And on this graph, you can also see that there are various calamities, as with all pre-industrial societies, there are various calamities caused by climate or war during the 19th century. But this year, 1867-68, is really the worst one, and the one that really makes this internationally significant. But for the book that I've just written, and for most of my studies on this period, I take a period from 1856 to 1868. And that's because there were 3 very significant harvest failures during this period. That is 56-7, 62-3, and 67-8. And basically Finland's resources are getting depleted all the time. The harvests don't make up for the emptying grain stores, and the fact that you don't have seed to plant for next year, and bankruptcies are increasing. People are becoming ever more vulnerable. So in this final year of disaster, when the harvest failed, as we mentioned earlier in 1867, such a huge proportion of the population are vulnerable because of the previous decade. It's not something that should happen overnight, that everybody would die in such huge numbers. And also, when I was writing this book, I was writing about some of the themes I'll talk about in a little bit more detail tonight. And it makes no sense to start them in 1867, because all of these things were in process before that, like eating emergency food, immigrating or migrating around the country, relief works like famine roads and so on. All of these things accelerate in 1867 to 1868, but they don't start then. So it would make no sense for me to start a book in 1867 and not say anything about what had gone before. So this kind of thesis of a decade of misery is much more prominent nowadays amongst famine scholars than just being one bad year. And these are the areas of Finland where the famine was worst in that year. And this is, I enjoy sharing this picture of the famine memorial in the parish of Parkano, which was the worst hit parish. Nearly a quarter of people died from typhus, especially, and hunger and other famine-related diseases. But when I went to find this memorial, this was a side project I've been doing, looking for memorials around Finland. It was hidden behind a bench. You know, it was not in a prominent place. It was really hard to find, and it's just a very simple stone from the period, and you can see it's got 1868 written on it. Excuse me. So I'm just showing this now, partly to show the epicenter of the suffering, but also to show how the famine is very significant, remembered in a very different way than in Ireland, at least in Ireland in the last 20 years. And I think it's important to set this out, I think, from an Irish point of view. I already mentioned it, but this is really the key difference between Ireland and Finland when it comes to famine remembrance. But as we'll see, it's not actually a big difference when it comes to how the famine was dealt with. And this speaks to some interesting questions in Irish history, and especially in so the Irish nationalist narrative, which I've certainly grown up with. And I'm not trying to, question it or rehabilitate the British actions and all of this kind of stuff. But I think it makes you wonder about the class element as much as other things in this kind of reaction to famine, because a lot of the rhetoric you see in Finland actually is really similar to the way in which people like Charles Trevelyan framed the Irish. So people in the countryside were lazy or unimprovable. This was God's punishment on them, and they needed to improve themselves, otherwise this would keep happening. You see this a lot of this rhetoric happens in Finland, but there's no let's say ethnic difference, there's no linguistic difference, there's no in the language of the time racial difference between the people who are saying this and the people who are dying. And in those circumstances, you start to see things through a kind of class perspective much more. I'll just take a little sip. And I found this interesting. Liam Kennedy in Queen's has mentioned this a few times. I'm not a combative or controversialist. I think Liam enjoys this kind of chat. But when the Atlas of the Great Irish Famine came out in 2012, Bill Smith's claim here that if there had been a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin, they wouldn't have ignored the cry of want. And again, I stress this, I'm not saying that they would have or wouldn't have, but I think the Finnish case does show that just having a Home Rule Parliament in and of itself isn't necessarily guarantee that you avoid famine, depending on what attitudes are shown in that Home Rule Parliament. So just bear that in mind maybe when we're going through this. So after Russia had taken over Finland in 1809, after many centuries of Swedish rule, Russia and Sweden went to war, and in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, and Finland ended up being a part of Russia after that. Now, the Russians didn't think that the Finns would necessarily learn Russian or start to operate their administration in Russian. So a kind of suitable decision was to allow the Finns to let their own language flourish. So the language of government in Finland had been Swedish, but the Finnish language was largely spoken in the countryside. Throughout the 19th century, then Finnish nationalists start to develop their interest in language. This is something else that is observed in Ireland, actually, especially amongst the young Irelanders. Maybe I mentioned that last time, but the Russians didn't really think that Finland or Finnish would be a serious language of government, nor more so than people might have thought that by the 1840s or 50s, Irish would actually come back and be a serious language of government. What I like to imagine here, in a kind of weird counterfactual, is the Finnish case would have been similar to what might have happened in Ireland had Napoleon been victorious. So in those circumstances, if for some reason Napoleon had taken over Ireland, he would then have encouraged the Irish language rather than expecting everybody to speak French, but rather encourage the Irish language to break away cultural and economic ties with Britain. And this is kind of what happened in Finland. So the Russians tried to get Finnish in place of Swedish within Finland to try and break these residual centuries-old ties to the old motherland. Oh, that's me halfway through. So Finland was essentially autonomous internally. It didn't cost Russia anything, and actually many in Russia, depending on the period of the century, actually quite liked the idea of showing off Finland to the rest of Europe as a kind of liberal, self-governing territory. Sorry. Yeah, I said that already. And Finnish nationalism develops, and then they come up with this kind of ideal stereotype of the Finnish citizen. And this includes things like self-sufficiency, very important, communality, so helping your neighbor and so on, stoicism and patience, persistence, and this kind of untranslatable word, civistus, which is equivalent to the German Bildung, but it's this idea of improvement through education and self-criticism and so on. So the people who were constructing Finnish national identity, these were very important. And I'll come back to this when I talk about the famine management. And the idea in Finnish nationalism was to almost be ignored by Russia. So just basically behave yourself, keep your head down, don't cause any trouble, don't cause them any expense. And especially when you compare Finland in the 1860s with Poland, for example, the Polish rebellions, Finland was perfectly happy to carry on being a well-behaved home rule society within the Russian Empire and develop Finnish nationalism from this kind of perspective. rather than being oppositional to the imperial power. But recently, especially maybe in the last 20 or 30 years, the nationalist interpretation of what happened in the 1860s has changed. So Finnish national history basically in many ways ignores this famine, or it's contextualized as some kind of economic blip in Finland's progress towards nationhood. But colleagues of mine like Antti Häkkinen, Heidi Ries, Lari Rantanen, they've all written in the last few years that actually what happened in Finland in the 1860s, the actions of their home rule government exacerbated the situation. And this here on the right is Johan Wilhelm Snellman, who's the finance minister at the time, or essentially prime minister. And this statue of him is outside the Bank of Finland, the central bank, which if you think he's basically the equivalent of Charles Trevelyan during the Irish famine, it's a bit weird for us to think of him being such a national hero. But he was a national hero because he was one of the promoters of Finnish language, Finnish identity, and so on. But he was also the guy who brought the new currency, the mark, to Finland, which was only replaced by the euro. So this was a very important element of Finnish independence. And this was just last week, actually, when I took a picture of him, so you can see how much snow we've had at the moment. It's also ironic that since the Central Bank of Ireland moved, it's actually now opposite the Jeannie Johnson down on the quay with those Rowan Gillespie statues. So that's just a coincidence, but it's a very interesting contrast between the two. But when these harvest failures started to affect Finland, there was a real strong element amongst the elites in Finland that this is teaching the common people a lesson, and the way they need to react to it is to get themselves through it through their own efforts, and not through asking for charity, definitely not asking for anything from the Russians. So on a national level and also on an individual, like domestic level, Finland and the Finns were expected to get through this famine by themselves. And the rhetoric that comes from Helsinki at this time is really similar to the rhetoric that comes from London in the 1840s. So I already mentioned there was this idea of a God-given test to test the people's strength, or to get rid of the weaker people, and all of this kind of stuff. And actually the eventual success of the national project, so Finland becomes independent in 1917, it basically meant that there was no blame. There was no question of who was to blame for this famine. It was just accepted that it was God who sent the frost. So, you know, this maxim of Mitchell, that, you know, God sent the blight, but the English created the famine. In the Irish case, it's almost opposite in Finland. There was no blame on the administration at all, no blame on Russia, because that would have been an admission that Finland wasn't able to run itself. So that's why, you know, things are remembered so differently. Yeah, so there's a few aspects of the famine I thought I would just speak more about, and this is kind of following on from my exhibition. I had an exhibition in Strokestown in the Famine Museum, and it went around Ireland for a while, and these were kind of the themes that I chose were kind of based on discussions with people, what would be the most interesting. So I guess for the second half, or for the next quarter of an hour, I'll just go through some of these things. And one of the key elements of the self-sufficiency narrative is this bark bread. So bread, you know, when all your food is gone, how can you survive? And one of the things that happens in Finland is that in rural communities and in the north of the country and in other parts of Scandinavia, you can take the inner layer of the bark phloem and mix it with flour to help the flour last longer. And this was seen as a way of getting through a hungry gap, or for surviving one harvest failure. But it wasn't really a long-term strategy that you could survive on for 12 years. And actually this kind of bread, you can see it here, bark bread on the left and lichen bread on the right, was sent to foreign countries to show like that they're living on this. I actually have some here. And you can, I guess, it's pretty hard. And it smells of bark, but this will last forever. You know, it's got hardly any flour in it. but people were able to eke out some kind of existence on that. But the administration also tried to improve the habits of the people as they saw it by getting them to eat mushrooms, which people didn't like. Nowadays in Finland, it's very common to go mushroom picking. People didn't take the mushrooms then. They were suspicious of them. Actually, the government said that all mushrooms are edible as long as you boil them, and of course people died. So that then didn't help the situation of trying to persuade people to take these mushrooms. Lichens were the main resource. Then people were invited to come to learn how to make lichen bread and then go back to their communities to spread this propaganda. And then actually by the end of the 1866-67 period, you can see that local governors in Finland basically think, oh, our job is done now. We've taught the people how to make this bread out of lichens, and that will help them survive. And it just doesn't work. It's not a long-term strategy. It's not a way of overcoming such a huge loss of the cereal crop that people can just suddenly go and find lichens, process it into flour, and so on. But not least because snow is covering most of the country by this period. But the attitudes of the elites in Helsinki were really like, okay, this is a way of teaching people now that if they don't learn these skills, they will have this kind of terrible famines repeatedly. There's also a question to do with land ownership. So people aren't actually given access to land always. The forest industry was growing in Finland at the time, which was important to the government, but that led to privatization of forests. So people weren't allowed to go there always. There were taboos. For example, there's some reports of starting to eat your horses in the on the farms, but you weren't. I mean, you're not going to get very far eating your horse. It's not going to replace a year or 2 years of a harvest. Frogs were promoted. No reports of cannibalism in this case, which I think is also partly to do with Finland's position as a home rule state. Most of the people reporting on this were Finnish. You get reports of cannibalism in Ireland, in Mayo, actually, in the 1840s, from a Church of Ireland minister. You get reports of cannibalism in Algeria in the 1860s, famine from French missionaries, and in Ethiopia then in the 1880s and 90s, from outside missionaries. So it's often an external gaze that starts to notice that there's cannibalism possibly being suspected to make the people seem barbaric. There wasn't really that kind of reporting in Finland. There wasn't any Russians or anybody who had any interest in promoting the Finns as being barbaric. One of the first things I did as a part of this bigger project was look into private philanthropy in the Finnish case, and it was really interesting to me that Finland was so popular, not least with the British. There was a lot of fundraising between 1856 and 1868 for Finland, and it's the same sort of thing you see elsewhere at the time. Concerts and lotteries and subscriptions raised for the famine-stricken Finns, and there is a really clear comparison here with Ireland, because a lot of the Quakers who were active in raising money for Ireland in the 40s were also to the fore in the 60s. And in an Irish case, people like Bewley, they were raising money for Finland in the 1860s. Again, a lot of this money, all of this money was not given as free charity. The rhetoric was exactly the same. Free charity corrupts. It leads to a kind of welfare dependency, if we use modern language. So all of the money that came in from abroad was funneled through the normal poor relief, which then implied that you had to build a road or some other task in order to get your flour. And then that was often cut with bark or with lichens as well. So there was no free charity. And like I said, the Trevelyan rhetoric of this corrupting the people was very much prevalent in Finland at the time as well. On the other hand, in external constructions of the Finnish people, they were hardworking, honest Lutherans. So in the British fundraising, especially, their very Protestantness is a very positive selling point for people who are being asked to give money to Finland. And one of the only pictures we have from the period is actually from a donation made to the Finlayson factory in Tampere from a worker in Manchester. There were strong connections between these factories through the cotton trade. And you can see here, actually, my bread, you can see on the picture, there's piles of this bread here on the table. So the children were made come to get this bread. 100 children were able to get bread from this donation from a man from Manchester, but they had to come and have a photo so that the British people could see that their benevolence was being used properly. And this gives us one of the only photos, contemporary photos from the time. Migration and vagrancy were also very prevalent at the time. Again, you see this going on from the 1850s onwards, people wandering around the country, begging, looking for work. And again, the people in Helsinki didn't want this. They wanted people to stay in their own parishes, to live, if they had to, with the local poor relief structures, but there just wasn't the money there from the central government to actually fund this poor relief properly. It kind of collapsed. So in the 1860s, you get people wandering around the country in search of work, going towards the local relief sites. But also, of course, this leads to a spread of disease and the communicable diseases. So this has a big impact on the overall death rate in Finland. But also when it came to this idea of the idealized Finn, the people in Helsinki thought that actually migration led to ignorance, that to be a proper Finn, you needed to be attached to the land, plough your land, raise your crops, and be a part of your local community. The itinerant lifestyle was seen to be corrupting as well. But I think partly, again, this self-contained narrative that Finland coped by itself is why the migration trope, these images you see from the famine that are created later, they often show these long files of hopeless migrants. But it's a much stronger trope than emigration outside of the country. And this is a big difference with Ireland. And I'll kind of finish with that. And now, as anybody will think of the Irish case, there's also this idea of forced labour in order to get this emergency flour. Same thing with India, all of these famine codes the British imposed in India. So in Finland, there were countless small projects of road building, draining bogs, putting small walls up, anything to make the people do some work for their charity. The biggest project is the railway from south of Finland to St. Petersburg, which later was a huge economic benefit for the country, but became known as the hunger track because thousands of people died whilst making that track, and there were lots of memorials along the sides. And again, the nationalist historiography in Finland presents these things as important sacrifices made by the people in terms of building up the country. It's not something that was imposed from a foreign government that can be used as a way of strengthening a kind of separatism against that government. Very different situation in Finland, but definitely the tales of humiliation, corruption, squalor, very similar to Ireland. They're just not really mentioned in the main nationalist narratives. They come through later in the folklore and the recollections of people who lived through the period. And then emigration. Now, again, a big difference in the Finnish case is that emigration did take place, but it was mainly to places that were accessible by land. There was no direct boat link to America. And then in the 70s and 80s, there was a direct boat link to Hull in England. Then Finns started emigrating via Hull, Liverpool to North America. But during the famine time, if people emigrated, it was usually north to Norway or to parts of the Russian Empire. And a lot of this emigration is kind of an extension of the internal migration, and people living in the border areas didn't really perceive historically to be a strong national border there. So it wasn't really conceived in a way of international immigration. And you definitely don't get a kind of angry diaspora living in Boston or whatever in anything like the same way that we experience in Ireland, who were able to then help to nurture and increase a kind of nationalist or Republican agitation inspired by the American Republican ideals and so on. So there is emigration from Finland, and it is very interesting, but it plays a very different part of the history than in Ireland. So for the last 5 minutes, I just put some reflections. I think I said last time I was speaking to you that if you asked me, there was kind of talk, I will come and talk about the famine. So, well, I could do that for about 5 hours at least. So I feel like I'm going over this a bit quickly, but I just wanted to throw out some ideas that maybe would be interesting to you. A big difference again with Finland is that the country recovered very quickly, also demographically. So if you imagine the way Ireland's population was, it reached a peak in the 1841 census and then went down and then continued to go down until very recently. If you make a similar graph for Finland, the population goes down in 1867, 68, and then it's like a small notch that then is kind of irrelevant actually in a long-term period. I don't say that the deaths of all these people are irrelevant, but just in a kind of statistical way, in a long-term perspective, you don't really notice that. So the birth rates go up again immediately after the Good Harvest in 1868, and the population by the 1890s is basically as it would have been anyway, and maybe even earlier. And actually some of the economic reforms that were associated with this autonomy, which caused a lot of trouble in the 1860s, were eventually justified. You know, they caused confusion between who was responsible for poor relief, for example. But eventually the economic and agricultural reforms that took place in the 1860s were conceived as being a part of this improvement in Finland's society and eventually independence. And any trouble like this famine, which killed 10% of the population almost, that was like a birth pang of the nation, that any nation has to have this kind of economic trouble when it's young. And so it's this kind of rhetoric is used. And of course, almost literally, given the cartoon symbolism, the bear in the room rather than the elephant in the room is ultimately, by avoiding Russian interference in the 1860s, Finland arguably stopped itself becoming a part of the Soviet Union. So this is why I think anybody who does think of the famine thinks of it as a way of underlining Finnish independence and self-standing. It's a very difficult question. I sort of pose it at the end of my book saying, well, how many lives were worth it? And I'm not answering that. I don't even really want to ask the question, but I think this is the underlying almost unspoken question that, you know, how many lives are worth it to have stopped Finland eventually becoming just a part of Russia and the Soviet Union. I think that is the question that Finnish nationalists probably have in their mind. And of course, the independence eventually of Finland in 1917 and the very bitter civil war, that's my time up, was 50 years exactly after the Great Hunger Years. And this is something that also kind of hides the commemoration of the Great Hunger Years, because it's always 50 years out of sync. So like 5 years ago, when it was the 150th anniversary of the Finnish famine, if you think back to, again, 1997 in Ireland, how big an event that was, in Finland, it was also the 100th anniversary of independence, which is a much nicer thing to remember. And, you know, if you're looking for public funding for an event or something like that, of course, this is a much preferable thing to think about. And there's no national memorial to the famine in Finland. But whether this is normal or not, Alex Duvall, the famine scholar of modern famines, thinks actually the Irish situation and the Ukrainian situation in terms of having a huge national famine memorial, that's the exception. Most countries that have famines, it's not a thing that you really want to remember. It's almost a shameful event in the national history, where a whole community has to basically fail in order for somebody to die of starvation. But there are over 100 local memorials in Finland that I've found going around the country doing field work. And I think they tell us a slightly different story about how this famine is remembered on a local level in a much more similar way, in a much, so on a local level, this is Atimaas, where my own family would have been buried, brought down by boat from Ballina. And basically these Finnish famine memorials are often in small graveyards, often very anonymous, often people have traveled there by boat. The bodies have been brought there by boat because Finland's so full of lakes. And most of the Finnish famine memorials look like these small scale Irish memorials. And I remember, again, I can't think, but there was one in Armagh somewhere, in Lurgan maybe, but just a small one in a graveyard. And actually in Finland, there are lots of these. There just aren't the huge public pieces of art that we have in Ireland and in New York and in Boston and in Montreal and all these other places. So it's much more like a kind of quiet memorial. But I do think just to finish off, I think the fact that Finland had a home rule government, yes, it did exacerbate the problems because they had to make these decisions which protected Finland's independence from Russia and didn't want the aid from Russia. But it's definitely affected how this famine in Finland has been remembered. And people like Cormac O'Grada and Mary Daly have pointed this out, that the fact that Finland's government was a home rule government has led to sort of historical amnesia in the Finnish case, which actually some would argue also happened in Ireland up until relatively recently. So I'm over time, and I'll maybe stop there, and hopefully there are some questions, and hopefully there are some points I raised which might be interesting, and I'm sorry I've gone over.